And I've noticed that my slides are not, Zoom is not following my slides as I go along. So I think I'm going to have to like, every time I switch a slide, I'm going to have to like exit out, move to that and then exit and then move back in. So it's going to be a little bit more abrupt than I would like. I would like to be able to just run right through this material, but I don't believe that Zoom is going to allow me to do so. Crap. I'm just going to leave it like that. John Paul did have some privileges, particularly the privilege of being a white man. Did whiteness and maleness constitute privileges? They were going to be. They were starting to be during these years. Look, we talked about this before. Social issues like racism, sexism, they don't just kind of free float or come out of nowhere, right? Human decisions affect these things. And that's just as true in this period of history. One of the great paradoxes of American history, but I don't think you can understand American history apart from understanding this, is that the very years in which we were building Jefferson's empire of liberty, we were also establishing an aristocracy in America, an aristocracy that went by the name of the white man's republic. So don't shoot the messenger. White man's republic is not my term. Who called America a white man's republic? The head of the Democratic Party in the 1850s, Stephen Douglas, routinely referred to the United States as a white man's republic. One of our leading politicians. We'll see in a future lecture that a Supreme Court justice would claim in 1857 that a black man has no right that a white man is bound to respect. In these very years of democratization, in these very years of expanding liberty for men like John Ball, Americans were making decisions to deprive African Americans, Native Americans, and women from these same opportunities, right? It's easy to think, white men, well, they haven't always ruled. People make decisions to bolster the privileges of some, to deny the privileges of others. And as a consequence, standing in the center of American democracy stands this aristocracy. It's a paradox. It's a contradiction. It's hard to fathom, but you have to understand that these two things are happening at the same time. We are expanding democracy at this very moment. We are building an aristocracy around being white and being male. We're making decisions to expand political rights, economic opportunities for some Americans, while we are making decisions in these same years to deprive other Americans of political rights and economic opportunities. Right? White man's republic did not have to be. That is the point of today's lecture. It did not have to be, but people made decisions during these very years to take away political rights and economic opportunities from African Americans, Native Americans, and women. Can't understand American history unless you understand this paradox. The very years of our democratization were also the very years in which we set up this aristocracy centered around being white and being male. Now, what am I talking about? Let's look at these three groups and let's look at decisions that Americans are making during these years. We've already talked about the decisions that were made, states that opened up political rights, states that provided more, the economic freedom of the country. We need to look at the other side of this era. We need to understand what else is going on in American history at this time, the decisions that are being made. First, let's talk about African Americans. Obviously, you know that slavery does not end after the American Revolution. In fact, the shift from tobacco production to cotton production, particularly after Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s, made it a lot easier to process cotton. Cotton around 1800 begins to take off as America's major cash crop. And literally, we'll see politicians by 1860 proclaiming cotton as king. Cotton stood at the center, not of the South's economy. Cotton stood at the center of the nation's economy, in some ways, even the world's economy. And with the expansion of cotton production came the expansion of slave labor and investment in slave labor, right? By the time of the American Revolution, you know this, should know this stat by now, there were roughly 350,000 enslaved persons. That number had been dramatically reduced right after the American Revolution because of all this, the states that were ending slavery. We're going to talk about those in a second. But just the disruptions to slavery as a consequence of the American Revolution, those numbers of enslaved persons in North America dramatically decreased. And there was reason to think that slavery would potentially be on its way out. In fact, the founding fathers, I think they hoped, following George Washington, when Washington died, he freed his slaves. The thought was, as slave owners just voluntarily give up their slaves upon their death, that slavery would die out in North America. That doesn't happen. Instead, slavery 2.0 or 3.0, I'm not sure which version you want to call it, dramatically takes off. So by the time of the Civil War, there are an estimated 4 million enslaved persons in North America. Expanding out from Virginia, the Carolinas in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, expanding out into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. And you see the rise of a different kind of slavery there. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but the slavery that had been there in the 18th century along the Tidewater states was pretty awful. The slavery that develops in Alabama and Mississippi 2.0, 3.0, in slave labor camps, that slaves are exported out of the Tidewater regions and into these new regions of cotton production, is probably the worst forms of slavery the world has ever seen. Americans are, what are they doing with their newfound liberties during the American Revolution? They're not just doubling down on slavery. They're producing one of the worst forms of slavery this world has ever met. I can't think of a better, even if you're not interested in something, I can't think of anything you would rather do over Christmas break than read a history book. So put this on your Christmas list. Ed Baptist's book, The Half Has Never Been Told. I read it this summer. You might have heard of the 1619 Project, which is a project that's trying to kind of educate Americans a little bit more on the centrality of slavery, especially to America before the Civil War years. Ed Baptist's book is a foundational text to that project. And so, like, all right, I need to figure out what this is. And I read it, and it's just, I mean, I'm in tears reading the first half of that, understanding the slavery that's developed there. I mean, human beings were literally being whipped into becoming ambidextrous. Slave drivers were whipping their slave into becoming ambidextrous so that they could take cotton more efficiently. It's really unbelievable. And, you know, then it gets even worse when slavery expands from Alabama and Mississippi out into Texas. Had the Civil War not been fought, or had the Civil War gone a different way, then you would have had just the multiplication of even worse forms of slavery being developed. And understand this, it's easy for some to say, oh, well, slavery, well, that was just the South, or not even the South. Only 25% of Southerners ever owned slaves. And of that 25%, only 5% ever owned more than 5 slaves. So, like the kind of large plantation systems you might know from a Gone with the Wind movie, this really wasn't the norm. There were probably less than 150,000 slave owners in America at any point in our history. And so it's easy to say, well, slavery has just been a few bad apples, right? No, cotton, not just cotton, but investment in slaves and slave trading. Yeah, I mean, the international slave trade is banned in the United States after 1808, but the domestic slave trade dramatically picks up after 1808. And the amount of investment coming into slaves, and it's unreal, right? And I think that, I don't know if you heard this from Coach. It's a story I think that Yankees like to tell themselves, that, you know, cotton production in the Southern agricultural economy was ultimately inefficient, was ultimately going to lose out to the superior manufacturing power of the North. As though somehow these were like separate realities. What was the first manufacturing base in the North? Some of you might have read this in Maclay already. The textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1819. What were textile mills making? Clothing. What were they making this clothing out of? Cotton. Guess where the cotton was coming from? So Yankees might want to try to, you know, tell stories to excuse themselves from slavery. You read Ed Baptist's book and you understand just how institutionalized on a national scale cotton production and slave expansion. So when slave drivers in Alabama were whipping their slaves and becoming ambidextrous, New Yorkers had a hand in it. Michigan comes along a little bit later, but Michigan had a hand in it. There's no getting around it. It's a national institution, a national discourse. But that's not what I want to focus on.
So if the South being like 55% white,
I mean, ultimately, even though Southerners didn't own slaves, they still felt a particular affinity with slave owners. Even if you didn't own slaves, you still desired to be part of a kind of master class, even if the only people you could master would be your wife and your kids. And so there was a culture of masculinity in the South that united men, whether you owned slaves or not, that did help create this regional identity of being South as opposed to North. So why you would learn in school North good and South bad, I'm not entirely sure about that. I think it's because, well, South had slaves, North didn't. Well, yeah, it's because the South, you know, the slaves were we're talking about that. The slaves were concentrated in the South, right? That's where the cotton production is taking place. But I don't know. If you're learning North good, South bad, your teacher's probably not teaching you right. It's just you need to understand the realities of the North and South and why they made the decisions that they made, right?
right? And we'll get to that. And here, obviously, we're going to talk about the buildup to the Civil War and stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think Yankees want to pat themselves, Yankees want to find ways of distancing themselves from the institution of slavery, and well, Yankees weren't the ones who seceded from the Union, and Yankees did ultimately preserve the Union in the end. So I guess if Yankees we want to pat ourselves in the back for that, for saving the United States, but that does not excuse Northern deep Northern complicity in slavery. And as I want to, kind of focus on here, just because slavery ends in the North does not necessarily mean racism. So what's going on up South? This is what many African Americans in the South call Northern states, up South. Because the African American experience of American history is South is pretty racist, North is pretty racist too. I was just talking with an African American retiree over at one of the over Arbor Oaks. When we were talking about this issue, and he was like, "Yeah, no, that's what we call Michigan up South." Yeah, African Americans in Michigan, they face discrimination here. So what's going on up South? What's going on in Northern states? Starting in 1780 with Pennsylvania and ending with New York in 1820, almost all the Northern states abolished slavery. They abolished slavery, and Pennsylvania does it because slave owning there was so disrupted by the American Revolution. Most slaves ran away to Canada or joined the British Army. There just weren't that many slaves left by 1780. So Pennsylvanians were like, yeah, let's end this thing. Plus, Pennsylvania had a long Quaker history of moral opposition to slavery. So Pennsylvania is first. Eventually, New York gets there by 1820, but Northern states, because there weren't that many slaves, they could imagine, they can imagine slavery ending without it being a big social disruption in the way that Southerners could not. We'll talk more about that in future lecture, but let's focus on the Northerners could end slavery and feel it wasn't going to be a massive social disruption. So Northern states, beginning with Pennsylvania, ending with New York, they abolished slavery between 1780 and 1820. Not inconsequential population. As I said, 4 million enslaved persons, 4 million enslaved African Americans in 1860, 500,000 free Africans and African Americans in Northern states in 1860 as well. So not inconsequential numbers. What was the experience of these freemen in Northern states? Almost immediately, where slavery ended. You guys remember Jim Crow, right? We think of Jim Crow as like a Southern thing, right? No, Jim Crow actually starts in the North. And that's because slavery ended in the North. And almost immediately, where slavery ended in the North, we see patterns of segregation begin to emerge. So the historian who studied the Philadelphia case, for instance, slavery is ended there. Almost immediately, the freemen begin experiencing discrimination, lack of job opportunities. No one will hire them. Lack of educational opportunities. They're barred from going to schools. Where they can move, where they can live. All this stuff is being restricted. Just if not by kind of local laws, just by citizens just refusing these free persons of color being able to move or work. A dramatic instance of this came in 1805 in Philadelphia. Look, Philadelphia is the center of national independence. That's where the Declaration of Independence was signed. That's where the Liberty Bell is. And so July 4th, after 1776, July 4th, center city, Philadelphia, that's where the party is, right? That's where Philadelphians come out to party to celebrate American independence. And after 1776,
it was African Americans coming out to celebrate, particularly after 1780, after winning their freedom. They are coming out on July 4th, 1776 to celebrate their independence, not just from England, but their independence from slavery. And they can do this. This is a multiracial celebration until 1805. In 1805, we have the story that African Americans were driven out of the celebration and never returned to it. This is a reality of free blacks in the North. Yes, they are free from slavery, but they are not allowed just kind of your basic social, economic rights, with one exception. In most northern states, after 1790, in most northern states, free black men could vote. You might not be able to find employment, might not be able to send your kids to school. You might be stuck living in pretty awful conditions in a northern city, but you could vote. Free black men could vote until they couldn't. This is the point of today's lecture. In the very years that Americans are making decisions, let's give more political rights to these guys. Americans are making decisions, let's take away political rights from these guys. And so what you begin to see after 1820 is these voting rights that African American men had. Northern states start taking them away. Let's talk about New York's Constitution, 1821. We weren't the first to do so. Connecticut actually, Connecticut had done this before. I talked about Connecticut in last lecture. I said, as a result of the War of 1812, Connecticut said, "Hey, let's expand voting rights. All white men of Connecticut can vote." That white was a crucial decision. Connecticut said, "We're going to expand voting opportunities in 1819 for white guys." Connecticut made the decision in that very constitution. Free black men were not going to be able to vote in Connecticut. New York had just ended slavery in 1820. 1821, they're having a constitutional convention. And one of the questions that comes up, African American men were allowed to vote under New York's 1790 Constitution. Free black men could vote in New York under the New York 1790 Constitution. This is crucial. New York has the largest population of free men, about 40,000 in 1820. So free black men were not a small number of free black men who could vote in New York. And the legislature comes together and tries to decide, as we write up this new constitution, how are we going to work this out? Should free black men should still be able to vote in New York? And they debate amongst themselves. So I don't have this exact quotation, but one of the representatives said this: "Look to your jails and penitentiaries. With whom are they filled?" He's trying to make the point. Look, all these black men are in our jails. They're not fit to vote. There's something wrong with them. Segregated people enduring segregation. This is kind of what happens when you deny people opportunities for legitimate ways to make a living, to exist, to survive. They'll turn to illegal. Or it's not even that. Sometimes it's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. Just your racist decision that there's something wrong with those people leads you to find evidence that's not really evidence. And so New York's prisons, jails disproportionately have persons of men of color in these jails. But we understand, or we can reason, even just from, conditions that are similar today to back then, where we understand what's going on here. When you deny basic rights and opportunities, when you continue to engage in racist stereotypes of people of color, big surprise that they will be overrepresented in your prisons. And so rather than confront the racism that was leading to these conditions in New York, this particular legislature said there must just be something wrong with those people. Ultimately, his fellow constitutional writers agreed with them. New York's 1821 Constitution expanded voting rights for free white men. They made a decision in 1821, New York did, to remove property qualifications for voting for white men. More white men could vote in New York after 1821. Under this same constitution, New York increased property qualifications for voting for black men. And almost all black men in New York were disenfranchised because of this. Look, the very same constitution, which is granting more political rights to men just because they are white, are depriving other men of their political rights just because they're black. This is my point. People are making decisions. Guys are making decisions. Particularly white guys are making decisions during these years to grant and expand privileges for themselves. In this case, voting rights for themselves. While they're taking those rights away from others. It wasn't like black men could never vote in New York. They could. They did. Until New York's Constitution made that impossible. Pennsylvania will be the final state in 1833. They will rewrite their Constitution, taking away voting rights from free black men as well too. Understand, people make decisions to pass racist policies. Racism, racial discrimination, racial disparity grow from these decisions. Racism is not some free-floating thing out there that we can't understand or we can't control. No, people make decisions. To fight racism, this is a time in which somehow Americans are expanding democracy and expanding racist policies at the same time. And so before you point your finger at the South and blame them for slavery and Jim Crow, understand that just because northern states ended slavery in years after the American Revolution, we pioneered segregation. We pioneered ways of depriving persons of color of basic social, economic, and political rights that they had had for a while. Later generations decided to take those rights away. Let's talk about Native Americans. Particularly, let's talk about the tribes who were living in the southeastern part of the United States. Spread out, centered in Georgia, but spread out through Mississippi, Alabama. These were known as the 5 civilized tribes. Known at this time as the 5 civilized tribes. Thomas Jefferson, as president of the United States, one of the issues he had to deal with is, well, look, I mean, he was a president overseeing Western expansion. One of the questions that presidents had to deal with, particularly those encouraging Western expansion, is where do Native populations fit into it? Right? They're there. right? These tribes, the only one you really need to remember or ask me to remember is the Cherokee, right? These tribes are there. They're where they have been for centuries. What do we do? And Jefferson will go to these southeastern tribes and he will say, look, your days are numbered, right? You lost the culture war. It's over. However, if you will abandon your traditional ways and if you will adopt the culture of the West, the culture of the United States and European culture, if you will become like us, if you will assimilate, we'll leave you alone. Actually, Jefferson's a lot more conflicted on that. He apparently communicated that message at certain parts of his presidency behind closed doors. He was actually a proponent of Indian removal. We'll get to that in just a second. So Jefferson, like Jefferson is conflicted on like almost everything. Jefferson was very conflicted on the status of Native Americans in the Southeast. On one day or one side of his mouth, he's saying, yes, there's a place for you if you guys will assimilate and become like us. Behind closed doors, he's like, nah, I don't think this is going to work. And so Jefferson occupies a really, in Native American history, just like with slavery, Jefferson occupies a pretty conflicted place. But whether Jefferson meant it or not, there's a reason they're called the five civilized tribes, because this is what these tribes attempted to do. They accommodated Western styles of dress, and they learned English, and they tried to send their kids to American schools and universities. They tried to become, I forget what his name is. He was a famous Cherokee lawyer. Remember good old John Ball went to law school to become a self-made man? Native Americans were trying to do the same thing too. The Cherokee were trying to send their kids so that their men could become self-made men. The Cherokee were in many ways the pioneers of slavery 2.0. The Cherokee were some of the first to ramp up cotton production and slave-based cotton production. Cherokee, like the other tribes in this region, are trying to do everything they can to try to assimilate to American culture and fit in. How is that message being received by the people of these different states? Not well. In fact, five civilized tribes was often uttered more of like a joke. The belief that these savages could somehow become like true European descendants or Americans is considered a joke. Like they couldn't do it. And so you can find article after article after article criticizing these five civilized tribes for trying to do something that Americans believed was impossible. So here these tribes are trying to follow the advice of Thomas Jefferson. And people of the states aren't having it. Georgia finally has had enough in the 1820s. 1828, Georgia threatens Indian removal. Georgia's going to pass a law saying Native American tribes, you got to go. We're moving you out west. Indian removal. You don't belong here, not a part of the United States, got to go. Andrew Jackson, who's president of the United States now in 1828, Andrew Jackson, the leader of the democracy, he takes up Georgia's cause, and in 1830 encourages Congress, which Congress does. Congress passes a national piece of legislation, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. They did it under the pretense of, well, we can't trust the states, we can't trust Georgia to conduct Indian removal in a peaceful and responsible kind of way. So the federal government's going to oversee this. The federal government will, in a benevolent way, remove the 5 civilized tribes out to present-day Oklahoma. And shouldn't the federal government be congratulated for its generosity in helping these 5 civilized tribes have a future in the North American continent? Well, no. It's their land. It's not the land of Georgia or the United States. It's the land of these tribes. Not only that, but these tribes have been trying to do everything they could to try to say, look, we don't have a beef with you guys. We can be like you guys. You want us to become lawyers? We can become lawyers. You want us to, wear bow ties? We can wear bow ties. You want us to become slave owners? We can do slave owning. We can do cotton production if you want us to. They're trying to do everything they can to communicate. We can fit in here. The people of Georgia now with Andrew Jackson's backing say, you got to go. We're talking about tens of thousands of people were threatened with forced removal. Well, there's a reason that Cherokee were sending their kids to law school. They could see this coming. At some point, Georgia or somebody is going to come to our land. We need to be able to defend ourselves. And so now several tribes, starting in 1830, they begin the removal process. They start voluntarily selling their land to their white neighbors, and they begin the process of relocation. Between 1830 and 1838, the so-called Trail of Tears would take place. This was supposed to be a benevolent process. In fact, as much as 25%, or we're talking about, like, I've seen estimates as high as 4,000 Native Americans were dying on the Trail of Tears as forced removal out there going on. The Cherokee will put up the strongest defense against the Indian Removal Act. They'll say, look, this is unconstitutional. This is our land. The Supreme Court will hear a couple cases. The first case they heard in 1831, the Supreme Court kind of shot the Cherokee case down. 1832, the Supreme Court of the United States seemed to side with the Cherokee. And I say seemed, it was not entirely clear that what the Supreme Court was saying was that the Indian Removal Act was unconstitutional. They weren't that explicit. But a lot of people reading the Worcester versus Georgia decision of 1832 from the Supreme Court, a lot of people are saying, this is the end of the Indian Removal Act. The Supreme Court is saying, no, the Cherokee have a right to that land. They can stay. So again, look, this period of history is not this kind of inevitable, well, Native Americans are just dying off, or Native Americans are voluntarily selling their land and moving. I've seen high school textbooks that try they take this whole history of land appropriation of Europeans over Native Americans, and they narrow it down to a few sentences. I've seen this in high school history textbooks. Native Americans saw, this is from the textbook, Native Americans saw that Europeans needed more land, and they sold their land to them. No, that's not. In some cases that happened. In other cases, this happened, the Indian Removal Act, where tens of thousands of Native Americans were being deprived of their land rights. You say, did they have right to that land in the United States? Did these Native Americans have a right to that land? Supreme Court in 1832 said, yeah. Or seemed to be saying yes. It needed kind of further elaboration. Time that was not going to be afforded the Cherokee. We don't know whether this actually, we don't know if he said this or not, but the effect was still the same. It's rumored that Jackson, when he heard the Worcester decision, said, well, the Supreme Court has made its decision, I'll let them enforce it. Let me ask you, constitutional scholars, what power does the Supreme Court have to execute any of its decisions? That's the goal of the executive branch. The Supreme Court says you can't do this, and the executive branch says, okay, I guess we can't do it. In this particular case, the Supreme Court says you can't do it, and the executive branch says, yeah, we don't know whether Jackson said that or not. But Jackson allowed removal to take place. And so eventually, even the Cherokee by 1838 were removed. Securing the United States as a white male republic. Driving Native Americans out of their ancestral lands. Provide economic and opportunities for young white men and their wives who come along to become cotton farmers in Georgia and other southeastern states. Before slavery could expand into these regions, the United States needed to remove the people who were already there. The people who the Supreme Court said apparently had a right to be there. Look, the building of America as a white man's republic, in the very years which we were trying to establish America as an empire living, we can look at the decisions that are being made. We can look at those turning points. We can look at those places where America could have not been a white man's republic. Northern states didn't have to take away voting rights from African American men. They chose to. Southern states didn't have to deprive Native Americans of their land. They chose to. So again, I want you to understand that the white man's republic is something that Americans are building. It's not something we just naturally were. It's something that we are actively building during these years. We are making decisions to give greater economic and political rights to white men. We are depriving non-white men of those same rights. Talk about women. We talked about the American Revolution as encouraging African Americans to say, oh, you guys feel like you're enslaved by England? We kind of feel like we're enslaved too, by you. So if you really care about liberty, why not? How about freeing us from slavery? And there was, during the Revolutionary period, a significant questioning of slavery. No matter what. Women were looking at this rhetoric of the American Revolution. And they were asking the same kinds of questions. You feel like you're being tyrannized? You want independence? You want freedom? Hey, women, we kind of feel tyrannized too. By you, by her husbands. So while you're rethinking the whole liberty thing, why don't you rethink women's rights too? The American Revolution did inspire some to think about women's rights. Most famous of them was Abigail Adams.
the wife of John Adams. She didn't really advocate for this publicly too much. She didn't want to embarrass John. You just don't do that at this time. But she did feel like she needed to speak her mind to John. And she would do that through some letters. So this is one of the more famous letters of American history. Abigail Adams writing to John. This is, let's see, March 31st, 1776, so a few months even before the Declaration of Independence is being signed. Abigail writes this to John: I long to hear you have declared an independency, meaning from England. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose would be necessary for you to make, I would desire you would remember the ladies. A rallying cry of feminism throughout American history is Abigail Adams, remember the ladies. It comes from this letter. Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If their particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to start a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Right? You know, oh, no taxation without representation. Hey, how about property rights in which women actually have a say in crafting those property rights? Women didn't have property rights during this time. Hey, you know, while you're concerned about making a new political order, why don't you remember the ladies, John? That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us as the slaves of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by your providence under your protection, and in imitation of the supreme, make us of that power only for our happiness. Now that's pretty direct speaking on Abigail's part. I mean, what she's saying, look, you're all concerned about England's tyranny and gaining independence. Look around you, John. See how women are tyrannized, not just by their husbands, but by a code of laws, which gives their husbands an almost absolute power over women. While we think about moving towards a Republican form of government, a freer society, let's remember the ladies. Let's rethink women's place in society. Let's rethink women's place in marriage. Instead of this, you know, English gender norms almost placed men as parents and women as children. Women were almost considered children by their husbands, and that was seen as kind of the normal or natural order. And Abigail saying, hey, why can't we make this more of a partnership? Why can't husbands and wives come to see themselves as equals, as friends? How do you think John took it? John writes back on April 14th. As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. Gentlemen, in the future, if you get married and your wife asks you for something, do not laugh at her. I can tell you from experience that will not end well. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient at schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter is the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are too saucy. I won't blot it out. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they're little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, and rather than give up this, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all his brave heroes would fight. I'm sure every good politician would plot as long as he would against despotism, empire, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, whatever that is. A fine story indeed. I begin to think the ministry is deep as they are wicked, after stirring up Tories, land jobbers, trimmers, bigots, Canadians, Indians, Negroes, Hanoverians, Hessians, Russians, Irish, Roman Catholics, Scotch renegades. At last, they have stimulated the deliberate women to demand new privileges and threaten to rebel. Oh man. Well, I mean, it was an entertaining household. Probably good that John didn't come home for a while after sending that letter. I could not find her reply. She did reply. I could not for the life of me find it. So I can just kind of summarize it. The best words I can use is John, you bastard. That's pretty much how she replies. It's like, look, all right, you're not going to do anything for us. We're going to take matters into our own hands. And that doesn't happen. Abigail's threats. Look, there are some women who are issuing these kinds of threats, but it just doesn't really materialize. Certainly not like it would in the 1850s or in the 1960s. You do see some changes. There's not a lot of effort or desire or motivation, even coming from women, to really revise property laws or address cultural issues about how men and women are addressed, for instance. You do see some changes. And this has a part to do with the shift to, or the philosophy of republicanism, right? Under Republican society, the belief was, well, people need to be virtuous. Well, it's not just men who need to be virtuous, we need virtuous women. One of the ways that we can encourage virtue in women is through expanded women's education. And so there was, coming out of the revolution, there was some more attention to giving women better education. This is happening during the revolutionary years. It ultimately receives a champion outside of the United States, Mary Wollstonecraft. Anyone have to read Wollstonecraft before in high school or maybe for an SAU class? It's like just one person. Yeah, Mary Wollstonecraft is in many ways considered the creator, the progenitor of modern feminism, certainly modern feminist thought, for vindication of the rights of women. Inspired by the French Revolution. She's an English writer, inspired by the French Revolution, but even more inspired by the American Revolution. Wollstonecraft writes this book, Vindication of the Rights of Women. She doesn't really address the political situation, but she does make a strong argument for female education. This is what she says. Look, the reason that we think like men and women are so different is because we educate them different. If we gave men and women the same education, like if we allowed men and women to be like in the same college or like in the same classroom and to like hear the same lecture from the professor, what we'd find is that men and women are actually not that different. Certainly we would find that their mental capacities are not that different. That women can do kind of things that we think only men can do if we just educate them different. Do you imagine? I mean, what a radical argument Wollstonecraft is making. Putting like men and women in the same classroom, hearing the same lectures. Could you imagine a society ever adopting co-educational curriculum? Hopefully you're in on the joke. Right? But it was a pretty radical proposal at this time. John Adams would call Wollstonecraft that damned woman.
he wasn't even willing, and not many men were willing to get down the road of even experiment with female education. So there is some push for increased female education. There's even, and this is even more interesting, and honestly, it's hard to get a good handle. The records from this time are spotty, so it's kind of hard to know the voting statuses of women during this time. But it does appear that not only were during the Revolutionary era, it appears not only that women were, some of them were securing greater educational opportunities, it does appear that in some states, women actually could vote. The only one you need to remember is New Jersey. In New Jersey, women could vote up until 1808. And then New York writes its laws and women could not vote in New Jersey. Reiterating the point I've been trying to make through this whole hour. It's not like, oh, well, women were always marginalized. Women never had rights. It appears in places that they did. It appears that they had political rights in New Jersey. And in the very years that these states are expanding voting rights for white men, New Jersey makes a decision, women aren't going to vote anymore. An ideal of Republican motherhood, or just the kind of Republican sensibility which encouraged women to vote, maybe it seems like in some states yes, in some states no, but certainly under Republican philosophy of needing a virtuous society, it does seem to be some push for women to have more, at least educational opportunities, if not economic rights or political rights. However, in these years, a new ideal arises that becomes known as the angel of the house. The angel of the house, or the angel of the household. Sorry, I have to do it that way, but it's the only way I can think to try to get these actual slides onto the Zoom recordings. The Angel of the House, the title of an 1854 book, but it's an ideal that is, especially after the 1810s, it's an ideal that's really beginning to circulate in the United States. Women, what are women? What is women's role in a society, in any society? Women are the angels of the house. What exactly did that mean? This is an ideal, I should say, that is primarily being pushed by women and by pastors. They're the primary purveyors of this ideal. What does it mean that women are angels of the house? For 19th century writers, they weren't making a comparison. Women are like angels. Increasingly, writers argue women are angels. The expansion of America's Christian culture and identity during these years is having an effect on gender roles. And one of those changes is to imagine women not like angels, women as angels. So, I've read some of this literature. Writers are saying women's nature is literally different than males' nature. Women are more spiritual beings than men. Women have a nature that is closer to divinity than is men. Again, women, for a lot of writers, it's not that women are like angels. Women are angels. They're angels incarnate, placed in American society. And the job of these angels the idea of the angel of the household, honestly was very empowering to women in some ways. Who was going to be the guardian of the republic's virtue? Got to be the angels. Got to be the women. The women who have a greater spiritual and moral sensitivity. The burden of preserving the virtue and the Christian identity of the American Republic falls to women. Women must be the angels to their husbands, to their children. Women have to be the primary moral influences in our society. They have to soften. And the whole point of that poem is about how women, I don't know that, I think in that poem, I'm not sure the woman even gets to talk. I think all she gets to do is cry. But just like her presence among her husband and her children. I think this writer even wanted women to like verbally teach. This is kind of like a moral influence. The woman being there, the proper woman being there would just be this kind of like, through like osmosis, with like morality will go out into the husband and go out into the children and stuff. And so women would preserve both the moral character and the Christian identity of the republic. Under one condition, that they stay home. It's not the angel in the street. It's not the angel in the White House. It's the angel in the household. The woman stays an angel as long as the angel is protected by the 4 or 8 or 12 walls of the home. The dude goes out and works. The guy, this angel of the household literature. I mean, it's I published an article on this. I mean, it's funny how they talk about men. I mean, in this writing, like men have almost no moral compass whatsoever. It's men who like have to go out and like fight bears and fight politicians and fight each other in business, right? And then just go out and it's like the picture of like men is just this brutal, cutthroat Darwinian world where men are just going out and engaging in this warfare until about 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And then they come home. And there's the woman. This first line, man must be pleased. Man is made to be pleased by someone else, to be fulfilled by someone else. By him to please is woman's pleasure. Down the gulf of his condoled necessity, she casts her best. She flings herself. Woman's entire purpose is to complete the men in her life. That is why these angels were put on earth, because the men are incomplete. The men go out and they fight and they scrap. They do the hard work of building a country, but then they come home and they're soft by the angels. The children have no moral compass until they're given it by the angels. This is woman's job. Woman preserves the moral character of the republic as woman stays at home. As woman allows the men to go out and do the nasty work of empire building, but then man comes home and is softened by the woman, is Christianized by the woman. So it's a very exalting role for women. It's also a very confining role for women too. This is women as the angel of the household. And so big surprise is, look, there's talk all through these years whether women should be able to vote. And the conversation is always no, 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 no. In years before the Civil War, after the Civil War, states actually started giving women the right to vote. But years before the Civil War, it's no, women need to stay at home. Women will serve their country by not going out into their country. If women stay at home, that is how they will save the country, by saving their men. What happens if we let women go out into the country? What happens if we let women go out and like vote or start a business? What would happen? According to 19th century writers, women would become desexed. Sorry, I don't have this on the PowerPoint. Women would become desexed. What does it mean to be desexed? One of the pastors who wrote against women's suffrage, Horace Bushnell, wrote a book in 1870. Women's suffrage, the reform against nature. Women voting is unnatural. It's not just that it's wrong, it's that it's unnatural. If we allowed women to vote, if women start acting like men, so they start like being like business persons, or getting a college degree, or voting in elections, desex meant not simply that women would like start acting like men. Desex meant that women would become men. It was a biological fear. If women vote, their physiology is going to change. I'm not making this up. This is what desex meant. If women vote, their physiology would change. They would start looking like men. If women, like, balance the books of a corporation, women would, their physiology would change. If we allow women to vote, women are going to start looking like this guy, my hero, Zap Rasdauer, the most excellent Canadian film, Final Sacrifice. But this was the argument. This is the argument of desex, right? I mean, Bushnell imagined like this race of like half men, half women running around the country. It was, creepy stuff. But this is what desex meant. Women, if we allow them to do the things that men do, then they would stop being women. They would stop being angels. Physiologically, they would change, and we would just have a bunch of men and then like these half men running around. There wouldn't be any women anymore. This was the great argument put up against giving women the right to vote. Now, what do we think about this angel of the household idea? Imagine some people might, listening might go immediately to, so this is what the Bible preaches, right? That's it. The Bible preach that women are more spiritual than men, or that women have a particular moral responsibility that men don't have. That women are to be the primary moral influences over the children, that women aren't supposed to have a life outside of the home. Have you read Proverbs 31 lately? You probably heard of old Proverbs 31 wife. Have you read Proverbs 31? That woman's not staying at home. She's running all over the place, doing all kinds of stuff for her family. And this idea that, men go out and work and women take care of the kids. I don't know. I mean, you read Ephesians chapter 6, and you got Paul saying there, bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Who does he charge with that responsibility? Women? It says husbands. Bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, does that mean Paul thought women played no role in your children's intellectual and moral development? Obviously not. But Paul imagined that it was a husband's, a male responsibility to bring their children up too. It's almost like Paul maybe thought of like parenting as like a partnership, as like something both spouses should be involved in. And so I think we need to approach American history sometimes with a critical lens, the things that we might want to hold up as representative of our Christian identity. Ask some questions about it. I don't know how Christian the whole angel of the household idea really is. Or more specifically, let's say biblical. There's some other problems with it too. We can look at it from the standpoint of history. How many women fit this idea? This is the ideal that's being proposed through literature, through sermons, through articles. Women are to be the angels of the household. How many women actually can fit this model? Our first factory system in the United States was established in 1819 at Lowell, Massachusetts, the textile mills. Who were our first generation of factory workers? Us burly men, right? Like we see in all the pictures. Farm girls. Farm girls ran the factories at Lowell, Massachusetts. Our first modern industrial workers were farm girls. Now, granted, the reason they were doing that is because they were trying to raise some money so that they would be more attractive to a man for marriage. Nevertheless, what we know is that some women who went to Lowell, like, I don't like it here. I don't want to get married. I want to stay on. And so women never left Lowell. There's pioneers who went out west. Was it all husbands and the wife in the back of the wagon taking care of the kids? No, a lot of single women are moving out west too. In fact, the West gives us two images of women, probably three. I mean, one is the pioneer wife you probably know from TV. The other two are lesser known. Female missionaries, unmarried female missionaries, and prostitutes. The West was filled with unmarried female missionaries and prostitutes. Not exactly fitting either group, or necessarily fitting the angel of the household idea. And then the cities. It's estimated in the 1820s, and this angel of the household idea is taking off. New York had about 10,000 working women. Working class women. Women who maybe wanted to be angels of the household, but couldn't because they weren't married, because their husband couldn't find work, because their husband got sick or died and couldn't work, because they needed two incomes, all kinds of reasons why urban women work outside of the home. How do you think they felt about hearing this angel of the household idea? Women find their true purpose when they stay at home. And yet, not just the 1960s, the 1820s, the very years in which this idea is taking off, literally thousands of women, even tens of thousands of women, who just don't fit it. And then there are those women who started out as angels of the household or wanting to be angels of the household, and then life happens. One of those women was John Ball's sister, Deborah Ball. Can't get away from the Ball family. Deborah Ball. Deborah Ball married a New York, right? Remember Deborah Ball from New Hampshire? Deborah married a New York businessman. He was one of these self-made men types. He invested in floor oil cloth technology. What is Floor oil cloth. It's the forerunner of linoleum. If you know what linoleum is, that's what this guy is trying to pioneer. So, he's doing this in New York. Deborah marries him. Deborah wants to be the angel of the house. Right? She wants to be the angel. She wants to stay at home, let husband go out, build a business. She stays at home with the kids. She's some moral influence. That's what her culture is telling her she needs to be. Floor oilcloth factory. What would you imagine this factory would maybe be susceptible to? A lot of oil and a lot of cloth laying around. Fire. Building burns down. Husband in it. Deborah Ball is now widowed. What about the business? Deborah goes to her husband's creditors and said, look, we all kind of lost something, right? I lost my husband. You guys lost the money in the investment. Like, we're good. We can call it even, right? Her husband's creditors say no. Deborah couldn't inherit her husband's property. She could inherit his debt. So Deborah's like, all right, give me money so I can rebuild the factory then. So I can start the business again. So they do. John, remember John? In between being a lawyer and a school teacher and explorer out west, John comes down to New York and helps Deborah with the business. Although by John's own testimony, he says, honestly, Deborah, she brought me on to be kind of the foreman and but she really didn't need me. Just kind of doing things herself. So Deborah goes on to become a successful businesswoman. She rebuilds her husband's factory, pays off the revenue, continues to manage this business. Who is Deborah Ball? In an age of self-made men, Deborah Ball is a self-made woman. Ball stands out as a contradiction. Women aren't supposed to do this. They aren't supposed to be able to do this. Deborah Ball does it. Women aren't made of the character, the toughness, the roughness to be able to engage the business world. They aren't supposed to be living have a life outside of the home. Deborah, like thousands and thousands of other women, say, we got this. We can do this. The white man's republic is built upon contradiction, upon contradiction, upon contradiction. And eventually, those contradictions become too much. It's amazing that the white man's republic lasts as long as it does. The belief that white men, just because they are white, because they are male, are somehow to be granted the privileges of authority or unique authority in American society. It's amazing how long that aristocracy, in our democracy, how long that aristocracy persisted. But eventually the contradictions get too much. Eventually the contradictions begin to stand up and say, this is simply enough. It takes a long time for it to happen, but it does. In the 1960s. So much of the 1960s protests can be understood as a reaction to the white man's republic that is built during these Jeffersonian and Jackson years. We built, or I should say, some Americans in the past built an aristocracy around being white and being male. And then in the 1960s, Americans started to question that. They started to question the white man. Started to question the belief that white men were somehow uniquely gifted to run our politics and our economy. And ultimately, you would have to take 142 to kind of see the other side of that. See that work out. What's interesting is the white man's republic was built on the backs of three groups. women, African Americans, and Native Americans. Who are the primary persons who are questioning the white man's republic in the 1960s? It's women, African Americans, and Native Americans. It's when the contradiction, it's when the lies of the white man's republic just become too much to bear, that finally the challenge comes to the white man's republic. And we're in many ways still working that out. I like to say we're in a much better place. Yeah, 5 minutes yet, right? I do. 3 minutes left. All right, that's enough time. So I'd like to say that, you know, we're oh, by the way, remember that white man's, or remember that self-made man statue? It's actually a female artist who makes those. What, behind every great man stands a woman, like literally in this case. We'd like to think that we have put this white man's republic behind us, but from time to time, stories pop up to remind us that it's still there. The fight continues. That is the congressional swimming. Our U.S. congressperson have access to this, except when they don't. The story broke about maybe 10 years now. That women congressmen were not allowed, women congresspersons were not allowed to swim in this pool. Females could get elected to the U.S. Congress, but they couldn't swim, they couldn't use the congressional pool. Why? Some of the male congressmen like to swim naked. I know, it's disgustingly in the lecture, isn't it? Yeah, some of the males, congresspersons like to swim naked. You know, and female congresswomen, like, seriously? The head of the Senate at that time, Chuck Schumer, put an end to that. And so the pool, I believe, is now open to men and women. And I hope that the men are not swimming naked in the pool anymore. But, I mean, think about the attitude that would lead one to believe that I like to swim naked, and so I can do this and women cannot. That's not the 1830s. That's not even the 1960s. That's like your lifetime. Some men in power are still thinking that kind of thing. I think we are still wrestling with the legacy of the white male republic. Have a good weekend. You know, privilege.
Well, no, I
Swim
know.
naked.
I know years ago, it was kind of a prestigious thing. Like, why is that?
What, they